Hello. Today Road to GH will reveal the most important and engaging content on Wednesday, March 26th, 2025. First, Lulu had been carrying a heavy burden on her shoulders for weeks, a truth that clawed at her conscience every moment of the day. She had watched Brooke Lynn crumble under the weight of her secret, unable to muster the courage to tell Dante the truth, that he had a son he never knew existed. Lulu had urged her time and again, her voice laced with frustration and compassion, knowing that this secret could no longer remain buried. But Brooke Lynn remained paralyzed by guilt and fear, haunted by her decision to give the child away and terrified of what that revelation might do to Dante. For Lulu, the silence became unbearable, especially each time she thought about the child, a boy left without the love and protection of his father. The image of that child lingered in Lulu's mind like a shadow, following her through each passing day. She had accidentally discovered the truth, piecing it together through subtle clues, quiet confessions, and one heart-wrenching moment when she overheard Brooke Lynn breaking down in tears. At first, Lulu kept it to herself, unsure of how to proceed. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the child's future depended on someone doing the right thing. She couldn't ignore the sorrow in Brooke Lynn's voice or the ache in her own heart. That child had a right to know his father, and Dante had a right to know his son. It was no longer about secrets. It was about justice, love, and second chances. Determined to do what Brooke Lynn could not, Lulu finally confronted Dante. Her heart raced as she stood before him, knowing that the words she was about to speak would shatter the fragile calm of his world. She told him everything. How she learned of his connection to Brooke Lynn's child, how the baby was conceived in a moment they both thought would never resurface, and how Brooke Lynn, overwhelmed and confused, decided to give the baby up in secret. Lulu described the pain etched into Brooke Lynn's every expression, the loneliness of the child's fate, and her own moral obligation to step forward. Her voice trembled with emotion, but she didn't hold back. It was time for Dante to know the truth. But Dante didn't respond the way Lulu had imagined. Instead of the shock and sorrow she expected, his face twisted in disbelief. He questioned everything: her motives, her timing, even the accuracy of her information. It was too much, too sudden, and perhaps too painful for him to process. He couldn't reconcile the idea that someone he once trusted had hidden something so life-changing from him. The notion that Brooke Lynn had been living with the secret and that Lulu had known sent his mind into a tailspin. In a rush of confusion and raw emotion, he walked out without another word, needing answers not from Lulu, but from the one person who had remained silent all along. Fueled by a mixture of anger, betrayal, and desperate curiosity, Dante made his way to find Brooke Lynn. His heart pounded with 100 questions, each one more demanding than the last. Was it true? Had he really fathered a child? If so, where was his son now? Why had Brooke Lynn never told him? As he neared her, he braced himself for whatever truth would come, whether it confirmed Lulu's confession or unraveled it as a terrible misunderstanding. Either way, Dante knew that from this moment on, everything would change. His life, once steady in its routines, was about to shift in ways he never expected. Second, Ava sat across from Rick, her hands trembling as she recounted the terrifying events that had just unfolded. Her voice was uneven, laced with panic, and her normally composed demeanor had completely vanished. She couldn't hide the fear that clung to her like a second skin, not after what she had just experienced. In the dimly lit garage, Ava had come face to face with a version of Christina she barely recognized, wild, unhinged, and utterly consumed by rage. What began as a tense confrontation quickly spiraled out of control when Christina, behind the wheel of her car, accelerated toward Ava with a fury that was both reckless and terrifying. There had been no time to think, no time to react. Ava had barely managed to leap out of the way, her heart pounding in her chest as the vehicle screeched through the confined space of the garage. It was like watching a predator charge at its prey, and Ava, despite all her bravado, felt completely powerless. She ran without looking back, her heels echoing against the concrete floor as she escaped into the shadows, driven only by survival instinct. But even as she fled, a terrifying thought struck her. She didn't know if Christina had hit someone else in her rampage. There had been others in the garage, and the sound of crashing metal behind her still haunted her. Now, sitting in Rick's office, Ava struggled to steady her breathing. Her eyes darted around the room, as if expecting Christina to burst through the door at any moment. She described everything to Rick, the manic expression on Christina's face, the way her hands gripped the steering wheel, her complete disregard for reason. Rick listened silently, his jaw tightening with each detail. He had known Christina her entire life, but this was something else entirely. Something darker. Something unhinged. The image Ava painted was not of a woman acting out of hurt or anger, it was of someone who had lost control. Rick knew this wasn't just a personal dispute gone wrong. If Christina had truly attempted to run Ava down and possibly injured someone else in the process, then the situation was far more serious than either of them could have imagined. He urged Ava to lay low for the time being, to avoid any further confrontation until the full scope of what had happened could be understood. His voice was calm, but firm, laced with a growing concern that went beyond legal consequences. Christina wasn't just unstable, she was dangerous. Rick insisted that Ava find Sonny and tell him everything before the situation escalated further. For Ava, the suggestion brought little comfort. She knew Sonny's love for his daughter ran deep, and involving him might complicate things even more. But Rick was right, something had to be done, and quickly. Ava couldn't shake the image of Christina's eyes in that moment, wide, furious, and unrecognizable. She felt as though she had narrowly escaped something monstrous. And now, as she faced the aftermath, she realized that the true danger might not be over. It might only just be beginning. Third, Ezra had only just arrived in Port Charles, but he wasted no time in making his presence known. With a sharp suit, a disarming smile, and a reputation that preceded him, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had already mapped out every step of his political ascent. A rising star in the world of state politics, Ezra had recently formed a strategic friendship with Drew, and it was through that connection that he found his way to the mayor's office. His first official act in town was to request a private meeting with Laura, under the guise of introducing himself and learning more about the inner workings of Port Charles. Laura, ever the seasoned leader, recognized almost immediately that Ezra's interest in the town went far beyond polite curiosity. There was an intensity behind his polished exterior, a quiet calculation in his gaze that put her on alert. She had seen men like Ezra before, ambitious, clever, and always thinking 3 moves ahead. Their conversation was cordial, even pleasant at times, but beneath the surface Laura could sense the undertones of a veiled power play. Ezra asked pointed questions about city funding, local influence, and political alliances. He listened intently, but it was clear he was also assessing her, sizing her up as both an ally and a potential obstacle. Despite his charm, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that Ezra's arrival in Port Charles was part of a larger plan. His rapid rise in political circles and his association with Drew suggested he was positioning himself for something significant, perhaps a future run for office or a power shift that would require local support. Laura remained composed, offering polite but measured responses, aware that any sign of weakness might be exploited later. Ezra, for his part, seemed to relish the game, offering compliments wrapped in subtle challenges and flashing smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. As the meeting came to a close, Laura stood with a composed grace, extending her hand to Ezra, who accepted it with a firm grip. Their exchange had been professional, but it left Laura unsettled. There was no mistaking the ambition in Ezra's eyes. He wasn't just visiting, and he certainly wasn't here to play by anyone else's rules. She knew better than to underestimate a man like him. While others might be charmed by his intellect and presence, Laura had learned to trust her instincts, and something about Ezra told her that Port Charles was about to become the stage for a much larger political game. Alone in her office once more, Laura gazed out the window, her thoughts racing. Ezra was a threat, not in the traditional sense, but in the way a storm gathers slowly on the horizon, unnoticed until it's too late. He was dangerous because he was calculated, and because he knew exactly how to present himself as a visionary while working toward his own carefully guarded goals. Laura had faced many opponents throughout her career, but she knew this one would require caution, strategy, and perhaps even sacrifice. Ezra had arrived, and he was already setting the pieces in motion. Fourth, Jordan had been watching the tension simmer beneath the surface for some time, but now she needed answers. Sitting across from Curtis, her tone was calm but direct as she asked him about the current state of things, specifically, what was really going on with Portia and the escalating feud between him and Drew. Curtis, weary from the emotional weight he had been carrying, didn't hold back. He admitted that things had reached a boiling point. Portia was anxious, barely sleeping, and the pressure was mounting on both of them. The situation with Drew had spiraled far beyond a personal disagreement. It had become a power struggle laced with secrets, mistrust, and threats that neither of them could control. Curtis confided in Jordan that Drew was holding onto sensitive information, details that, if exposed, could unravel everything Portia had built and shatter the fragile stability Curtis had tried to maintain. He didn't reveal specifics, but the implication was clear. Drew wasn't just a rival. He was a real danger to them both. Portia, despite her composed exterior, was terrified of what Drew might do next, and Curtis, though determined to protect her, knew they were running out of options. The more pressure Drew applied, the more desperate they became to contain the fallout. Hearing this, Jordan's instincts as both a former law enforcer and a strategic thinker kicked in. She had long suspected that Drew's recent moves weren't purely driven by business or ego. There was something deeper, something calculated. She leaned in, her voice low but steady, and offered Curtis a proposition. If Drew had positioned himself as a threat, then perhaps it was time to stop reacting and start acting. Jordan proposed an alliance, a discreet and carefully coordinated effort to bring Drew down before he could cause any more damage. She didn't frame it as revenge, but as a necessary strategy to neutralize a threat before it became uncontrollable. Curtis hesitated, conflicted between loyalty, pride, and fear. Partnering with Jordan meant trusting her again, reopening a door that had once been closed for good. But as he looked at her, he saw the determination in her eyes, the clarity in her approach. She wasn't asking out of sentiment. She was offering a solution. Deep down, he knew that he and Portia were losing ground, and without help, Drew could easily turn the tides against them. Curtis nodded slowly, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. It was time to stop being reactive. With Jordan by his side, he might finally have a chance to outmaneuver Drew and protect everything that still mattered. As they outlined the first steps of their plan, an unspoken tension lingered between them, not only because of their shared history, but because they both understood the stakes. This wasn't just about power or pride. It was about survival. And now, with their alliance forged in quiet desperation, the battle against Drew was no longer just a private war. It had become a calculated mission, and Jordan was ready to lead it. Finally, be careful, world. Christina is on a warpath, and nothing is going to stop her now. The weight of loss, betrayal, and a truth she refuses to accept has twisted something inside her, transforming once righteous anger into a dangerous obsession. No matter how many voices speak out in Ava's defense, no matter how clearly the facts show Ava's innocence, Christina refuses to let go of her rage. In her mind, justice hasn't been served. Her grief over the child she never got to meet has morphed into an all-consuming desire for vengeance, and Ava has become the singular target of that fury. The fury simmering inside Christina had been building for days, a storm barely contained beneath the surface. She had watched the world move on, watched others offer Ava sympathy and space, while she herself was left drowning in unanswered questions and unresolved pain. The final straw came when she spotted Ava alone in the dim, echoing space of the parking garage. Something inside Christina snapped, a deep, primal scream that demanded release. Without hesitation, her hands gripped the steering wheel, her vision blurred with rage, and she accelerated toward Ava with brutal intention. Ava never saw it coming. One moment she was reaching for her keys, the next she was staring into the blinding headlights of an oncoming vehicle. The roar of the engine filled the air, drowning out every other sound, every warning. Christina didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. Her only thought was to hurt Ava the way she had been hurt, to make her feel the same fear, the same helplessness. In that horrifying moment, Christina became a force of destruction, driven not by logic or grief, but by raw, unfiltered emotion. Ava narrowly escaped, diving out of the way just in time as the car smashed past her. The screeching of tires and the echo of twisted metal reverberated through the garage like a scream in the dark. Heart pounding, breath ragged, Ava didn't stop to process what had just happened. She ran, her instincts screaming for survival. But even in her escape, a sickening dread settled in her chest. What if someone else had been in that garage? What if Christina had hit an innocent bystander in her rampage? Ava didn't know, and the uncertainty made the terror all the more real. Christina's war wasn't just against Ava anymore. It was against the truth, against reality, and against the pain she couldn't bear to face. And now, she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The darkness had consumed her, and as the dust settled in that garage, it was clear to anyone watching, Christina was no longer seeking justice. She was seeking revenge, and she was willing to destroy anything in her path to get it.